The colony world of Kepler 442b looked peaceful from orbit. Green continents stretched beneath white clouds, and the human settlements sparkled like scattered gems across the surface. Zefkar stood in the transport bay with his fellow Marines, watching the planet grow larger through the viewport. None of them knew that Velthari bioweapons had already been deployed in the northern hemisphere. "Looks quiet down there," said Danny Rodriguez, checking his rifle for the 10th time. The young Marine had become something like a friend during training, though Zefkar still struggled to understand the concept of friendship as humans defined it. "Too quiet," replied Lisa Chang, her voice tight with nervousness. She had grown more confident during training, but still showed the emotional instability common to her species. "Command says we lost contact with 3 settlements yesterday." Zefkar knew exactly what had happened to those settlements. Velthari spore clouds would have descended during the night, carrying mind-altering chemicals designed to break human resistance. The colonists would have experienced hallucinations, paranoia, and eventually complete psychological collapse. It was a standard opening move in Velthari conquest doctrine. The transport shuddered as it entered the atmosphere. Through his neural link, Zefkar could sense Velthari ships hiding in the asteroid belt beyond the planet. His people were watching, waiting to see how humans would respond to the initial assault. He was their eyes and ears among the enemy. "Listen up," called Sergeant Murphy from the front of the bay. "We have civilian populations under attack from unknown hostiles. Our job is evacuation and protection. Intelligence suggests the enemy uses chemical weapons that affect the mind. Stay alert, stay together, and watch each other for signs of contamination." The first landing site was New Portland, a farming community of 8,000 people. As the Marines deployed from their transports, Zefkar immediately noticed the signs of Velthari assault. Strange purple growths covered several buildings, and an odd smell hung in the air. The bioweapons were still active. The town seemed deserted until Staff Sergeant Maria Santos spotted movement near the school complex. "Survivors in Sector 7, she reported over the comm. "Looks like they have barricaded themselves inside." The rescue operation revealed the first glimpse of human nature that confused Zefkar. Instead of the broken, terrified civilians he expected to find, the humans had organized themselves into defensive groups. Teachers protected children while maintenance workers had somehow rigged makeshift air filters to keep the spores out. "How long have you been fighting this stuff?" asked Danny Rodriguez as they led survivors to the evacuation zone. An elderly man named Frank Miller, apparently the town mayor, wiped sweat from his forehead. 3 days now. Lost about half the town in the first 12 hours. But we figured out that the purple stuff does not work as well in sealed spaces. Been moving everyone into the school and the community center." Zefkar documented this information carefully. Humans had adapted to Velthari bioweapons faster than any previous species. Most civilizations collapsed completely within hours of first exposure. These colonists had not only survived, but found countermeasures. The evacuation was proceeding smoothly until Velthari ground forces arrived. Zefkar felt their presence through his neural link before the first energy blasts lit up the sky. His own people had decided to accelerate the timeline. "Contact! Contact!" shouted Lisa Chang from her position near the landing zone. "Energy weapons north side of town. Looks like powered armor." The Velthari assault was textbook perfect. 3 squads of warriors in biomechanical suits advanced through the contaminated areas, immune to their own weapons. Their energy rifles could punch through human body armor like paper. Each warrior was worth 10 human soldiers in direct combat. Zefkar expected the Marines to break and run. Any rational species would retreat in the face of superior firepower. Instead, Sergeant Murphy immediately began organizing a defense. "Santos, take first squad and set up a crossfire from the hardware store. Chang, get those civilians to the transports. Rodriguez, you are with me. We are buying time." What happened next challenged everything Zefkar understood about military doctrine. The Marines did not try to win an unwinnable fight. Instead, they focused entirely on protecting the civilians. They used their inferior weapons and tactics, not to defeat the enemy, but to delay them long enough for evacuation to continue. Danny Rodriguez positioned himself behind an overturned truck, firing controlled bursts at the advancing Velthari warriors. His bullets barely scratched their armor, but he kept shooting anyway. "Come on, you ugly bastards," he muttered. "I got all day." Staff Sergeant Santos had somehow turned the hardware store into a fortress. She and her squad fired from multiple windows, creating the illusion of a larger force. When one of her Marines was wounded by energy fire, she dragged him to safety without hesitation, exposing herself to enemy weapons. The most shocking moment came when a Velthari biomine landed near a group of escaping children. The device would detonate in seconds, releasing enough toxins to kill everyone in a 50-meter radius. Without thinking, Danny Rodriguez left his position and threw himself on top of the mine. The explosion should have killed him instantly. Instead, his body armor absorbed just enough of the blast to keep him alive for a few more minutes. As Zefkar knelt beside the dying Marine, Danny grabbed his arm with blood-covered hands. "Did they make it?" Danny gasped. "The kids, did they get out?" Zefkar looked toward the landing zone where the last transport was lifting off, filled with rescued civilians. "Yes," he said quietly. "They made it." Danny smiled despite the pain. "Good. That is what matters." He died still smiling. The action report Zefkar filed that night was confused and contradictory. Human military doctrine made no sense. They had sacrificed tactical advantages to protect non-combatants. They had fought an enemy they could not defeat instead of preserving their forces for future battles. By every logical standard, their response had been inefficient and wasteful, yet they had achieved their primary objective. Nearly all civilians had been evacuated. The Velthari forces had taken the town but gained nothing valuable. Most importantly, human morale had not broken despite facing superior technology. The next engagement came at Firebase Alpha, a human military outpost guarding a major population center. Colonel Frank Miller, apparently the same man who had been mayor of New Portland, now commanded the base. The coincidence troubled Zefkar until he realized that humans often took civilian leaders and gave them military authority during emergencies. Firebase Alpha was under siege for 6 days. Velthari forces surrounded the position and began a systematic assault using psychological warfare. They broadcast images of destroyed human colonies, played recordings of civilian screams, and released fear-inducing chemicals into the air. The standard response would have been gradual breakdown of defender morale, followed by surrender or flight. Instead, Colonel Miller seemed to use the pressure to forge his mixed force of soldiers and armed civilians into an effective fighting unit. "Every hour we hold this position," Miller announced over the base loudspeakers, "gives more people time to reach the evacuation ships. Every round we fire costs the enemy resources they cannot easily replace. We may not win this fight, but we can make them pay for every meter." Zefkar watched humans respond to this leadership with behaviors that defied analysis. When food ran low, they shared equally rather than hoarding supplies. When ammunition became scarce, they volunteered for dangerous missions to retrieve weapons from dead enemies. When the medical bay overflowed with wounded, healthy soldiers gave up their rest time to help with care. The breaking point came on the 6th night when Velthari forces breached the outer perimeter. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted throughout the base as armored warriors encountered human defenders in close combat. By all tactical assessments, the humans should have been slaughtered. Instead, Zefkar witnessed something that challenged his understanding of warfare itself. Humans fought in pairs and small groups, covering each other and combining their efforts. When one fell, others immediately moved to fill the gap. They used improvised weapons, environmental advantages, and sheer determination to slow the Velthari advance. Private Kevin Hall, the young Marine who had hidden his injury during training, somehow managed to disable a Velthari warrior with nothing but a combat knife and explosive charges. As the alien tried to remove the improvised bomb, Kevin triggered the detonation manually, killing them both. Lisa Chang rigged the base generators to overload, creating an electromagnetic pulse that disabled several sets of Velthari armor. She knew the pulse would also destroy all human equipment, but the temporary advantage allowed her squad to reach the evacuation zone. When Firebase Alpha finally fell, most of the human defenders were dead or wounded, yet their sacrifice had delayed the Velthuri assault long enough for the evacuation fleet to escape with over 200,000 civilians. From a strategic perspective, the humans had traded one military position for the preservation of an entire population center. Zefkar sent his second report to command that night, but found himself struggling to explain what he had observed. Zefkar stood in the center of the crystal chamber, his tall frame casting shadows across the glowing walls. The high command of the Velthari Empire surrounded him in a perfect circle, their dark robes flowing like liquid metal. Each member wore the silver mask that marked their rank, hiding faces that had seen the conquest of 17 star systems. "You understand the mission," spoke Command Prime, his voice echoing through the chamber without emotion. "This new species calls themselves humans. They have proven more difficult to break than expected." Zefkar nodded once. He had read the reports. 3 Velthari advance fleets had engaged human forces across the Outer Rim. Each time, the humans had fought longer than predicted. Their ships were weaker, their weapons primitive, but they refused to surrender even when defeat was certain. "Our bioweapons should have crushed their minds within hours," continued another command member. "Instead, they adapt. They find ways to resist what has broken every other species we have encountered." The chamber hummed with energy as holographic displays showed battle footage. Zefkar watched human soldiers fighting with damaged weapons, their faces covered in dirt and blood. They looked fragile compared to Velthari warriors. Their skin was thin, their bones breakable, their muscles weak. Yet something in their eyes made him pause. "We need intelligence from within their ranks," Command Prime declared. "You will undergo biological modification to appear as one of them. Your neural defenses will protect you from their primitive psychology. Study their military structure. Learn their weaknesses. Return with data that will ensure swift conquest." Zefkar had been chosen for good reason. Among all Velthari warriors, his mind was the most fortified. Years of conditioning had made him immune to fear, doubt, and emotional manipulation. He could observe without being influenced, analyze without being affected. The perfect spy for a species that valued mental discipline above all else. The modification process took 7 cycles. Velthari bioengineers reshaped his body to match human proportions. His height decreased, his strength reduced to human levels. His skin changed from gray to the pale brown common among human populations. Most importantly, they altered his facial structure and implanted false memories to support his cover identity. He would become Jake Martinez, a human military recruit with fabricated records showing birth in a place called Texas. The engineers had studied captured human databases to create a perfect background: parents who died in an accident, no close relatives, a clean military application with average test scores. Nothing that would draw attention. "Remember," Command Prime said as the modifications completed, "humans are emotional creatures. They make decisions based on feelings rather than logic. This makes them predictable. Observe their bonding patterns. Study how they respond to stress. Document their breaking points." Zefkar tested his new form in the training chambers. The human body felt strange, limited. His enhanced senses were dulled, his reflexes slowed. But the disguise was perfect. Even advanced human scanning technology would detect nothing unusual. The insertion went smoothly. Human military processing systems accepted his fabricated records, without question. Their security was laughably weak compared to Velthari standards. Within days, he found himself assigned to the 82nd Marine Battalion, training alongside actual human soldiers. His first day at the training facility revealed the species he was meant to study. The humans were loud, chaotic, and undisciplined. They laughed at inappropriate times, complained about minor discomforts, and seemed incapable of maintaining proper formation for more than a few minutes. Sergeant Ben Murphy, the training instructor, shouted orders with a voice that carried across the entire compound. He was a large man with scars on his arms and a permanent scowl. The recruits feared him, but Zefkar noticed something interesting. Despite his harsh manner, Murphy never struck the trainees or used the psychological torture common in Velthari. Training. Listen up, maggots, Murphy bellowed as new recruits lined up in crooked rows. For the next 12 weeks, I own you. You will learn to fight, to survive, and to protect each other. Some of you think this is a game. Some of you think you know what war is like. You are all wrong. Zefkar stood among them observing. The human next to him, a young man named Danny Rodriguez, whispered jokes under his breath. Another recruit, Lisa Chang, kept glancing around, nervously. These beings showed emotions openly without shame or control. It was exactly as the reports had described. Training revealed more weaknesses. Humans required 8 hours of sleep each cycle. They needed frequent meals and water. They complained about heat, cold, and physical exertion. Many struggled with basic combat techniques that any Velthari child could master. Yet Zefkar began to notice patterns that troubled him. When one recruit fell behind during long marches, others would help carry his equipment. When Lisa Chang struggled with weapons training, Danny Rodriguez spent his free time teaching her. They formed bonds that seemed to make them stronger as a group. During a night exercise, the instructors simulated an ambush. Most recruits panicked initially, but they quickly organized into defensive positions. Without orders, they began working together. Some provided covering fire while others moved to flank the simulated enemies. Their tactics were crude but effective. Not bad for week 3, Murphy admitted afterward. You are starting to think like soldiers instead of individuals. Zefkar filed this observation in his mental reports. Human combat effectiveness increased when they fought as units rather than lone warriors. This was different from Velthari doctrine, which emphasized individual superiority and domination. Weeks passed. The training grew more intense. Zefkar watched humans push beyond their physical limits through sheer determination. Private Kevin Hall, barely 19 years old, completed a 20-mile march despite a sprained ankle. When asked why he did not report to medical, he said he did not want to let his team down. The concept confused Zefkar. In Velthari society, showing weakness was shameful. Here, hiding weakness to help others seemed to be considered noble. The logic escaped him, but he documented the behavior for analysis. Graduation approached. The recruits had transformed from chaotic individuals into something resembling a military unit. They still laughed too much and showed too many emotions, but they moved with purpose now. They trusted each other in ways that seemed both foolish and somehow powerful. On the final day of training, Sergeant Murphy addressed them with unusual seriousness. You are Marines now. That means something. It means you will fight not just for your country, but for each other. When the time comes, you will discover what you are truly capable of. Zefkar received his assignment along with the others. The 2nd Marine Battalion was being deployed to a colony world where human settlements were under attack. The enemy forces were listed as unknown aliens, but Zefkar knew the truth. His own people had begun their assault. As the transport ship prepared for departure, Zefkar sent his first report to command. The humans were weak individually, but showed unexpected coordination as groups. Their emotional bonds appeared to be both a weakness and a source of strength. He recommended proceeding with the planned invasion, but suggested increased force levels to account for human unpredictability. He sealed the message and prepared for deployment, confident that his mission would succeed. He had studied the humans for months without being affected by their primitive psychology. His neural defenses remained intact. Soon he would witness their collapse under Velthari assault and return home with the intelligence needed for final victory. The transport ship jumped to hyperspace, carrying Zefkar toward a destiny he could never have imagined. The months that followed changed everything for Zefkar, though he fought against recognizing it. Each day spent among humans weakened the mental barriers that had protected him since birth. The Velthari conditioning that made him immune to emotion was breaking down under constant exposure to human behaviors that defied logical analysis. Firebase. Charlie became his new assignment, a forward observation post built into the mountains overlooking the contested valley. The base housed 200 Marines and support staff, all under the command of Colonel Frank Miller, the same human who had led the defense of New Portland and Firebase Alpha. Miller had been promoted after his previous successes, though Zefkar noticed the human seemed to carry the weight of every lost soldier. "Martinez," Miller called out one morning as Zefkar finished his patrol duty. "Walk with me." They climbed to the observation deck, where human sensors monitored Velthari movements in the valley below. Miller stood quietly for several minutes, studying the alien positions through binoculars. His face showed the strain of continuous combat, but his eyes remained alert and focused. "You have been with us for 8 months now," Miller said without looking away from his surveillance. "Longer than most. What do you think of our chances?" The question caught Zefkar off guard. No Velthari commander would ask a subordinate for strategic assessment. Military hierarchy was absolute in his culture, yet Miller seemed genuinely interested in his opinion. "The enemy has superior technology," Zefkar replied carefully. "Their weapons are more advanced, their armor better. By conventional analysis, they should have won months ago." Miller lowered his binoculars and turned to face him. "But they have not won. Why do you think that is?" Zefkar found himself struggling with the answer. His reports to command had become increasingly complex as he tried to explain human resistance patterns. "You adapt faster than they expect. You find ways to use their strengths against them. You fight for reasons they do not understand." "And what reasons are those?" Miller asked. The conversation was interrupted by alarm klaxons. Velthari dropships were descending toward the valley floor, beginning another assault on human positions. Miller immediately shifted into command mode, coordinating the defense with calm efficiency. "Santos, get your squad to Overwatch Position 3. Chang, I need sensor data on those landing zones. Rodriguez, prep the mortars for indirect fire support. Zefkar, watch the colonel orchestrate the battle like a conductor leading an orchestra." Every Marine knew their role. Every support element moved with purpose. The humans had learned to fight as a single organism, each individual part contributing to the whole. The battle lasted 18 hours. Velthari forces pushed hard against human defensive lines trying to break through to the supply depot behind the base. Human casualties mounted steadily, but the line held. When energy weapons overloaded the base power grid, the Marines continued fighting by starlight. When communication systems failed, they coordinated through hand signals and predetermined patterns. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos exemplified everything that confused Zefkar about human nature. Her squad had been cut off from the main force for 6 hours, surrounded by Velthari scouts. Instead of surrendering or attempting to escape, she led a fighting withdrawal that cost the enemy 3 times their number, while protecting a wounded Marine who could not walk. When rescue finally reached her position, Santos was barely conscious from blood loss and exhaustion. Her first words were not about her own condition, but about her wounded soldier. "Is Tommy going to make it?" she asked as medics loaded her onto a stretcher. Private Tommy Grant had been shot through the leg, but would recover fully. Santos had risked her life and the lives of her entire squad for one injured Marine. In Velthari doctrine, this would be considered criminal waste of resources. Among humans, it was apparently considered normal behavior. After the battle, Zefkar found himself assigned to help with casualty evacuation. He carried wounded humans to the medical bay, listened to their stories, and watched how they cared for each other. The experience affected him in ways his conditioning should have prevented. Corporal Amy Torres showed him pictures of her daughter while medics treated a burned arm. "She is 6 years old now," Amy said proudly. "Smart as a whip and twice as stubborn as her mother. She wants to be a scientist when she grows up, maybe work on one of the research stations." The casual way Amy spoke about the future surprised Zefkar. She was fighting a war against superior forces with little chance of survival, yet she planned for her daughter's education as if victory was certain. The human capacity for hope in hopeless situations was something his analytical mind could not categorize. Private First Class Chris Powell spent his off-duty time writing poetry about their experiences. He would sit in quiet corners of the base, scribbling verses on pieces of recycled paper. When Zefkar asked about this behavior, Chris explained that writing helped him process the emotions of combat. War does things to your head, Chris said. Simply, if you do not find ways to deal with it, it eats you alive from the inside. Poetry helps me remember that there is still beauty in the world, even when everything around us is ugly. Zefkar had never encountered the concept of voluntary emotional processing. Velthari warriors suppressed difficult experiences through chemical conditioning and mental discipline. The idea of deliberately confronting painful emotions seemed counterproductive, yet Chris and other humans who used similar techniques showed remarkable psychological stability. Sergeant Jake Williams maintained morale through humor, telling jokes even during the worst fighting. His ability to make others laugh in desperate situations seemed almost magical to Zefkar. Velthari culture had no equivalent to humor as humans understood it. "You have got to learn to laugh, Martinez," Jake said one evening as they shared rations in the mess hall. "Take life too seriously and it will crush you. Find something funny in every day, even if it is just how ridiculous the whole situation is." The psychological concepts were foreign to Zefkar, but he found himself drawn to these humans who had become more than subjects of study. Amy Torres asked about his family and seemed genuinely concerned when he gave vague answers about having no close relatives. Chris Powell offered to teach him about poetry, while Jake Williams included him in the constant stream of jokes and friendly insults that passed for normal conversation among the Marines. For the first time in his existence, Zefkar experienced something approaching friendship. The realization terrified him because it meant his conditioning was failing in ways that could compromise his mission. The crisis came when Command sent new orders through his neural link. The message was encrypted and brief. Sabotage human defenses. Prepare for final assault. Victory is near. Zefkar stared at the communication for hours, unable to process what it meant. His people were asking him to betray the humans who had accepted him as one of their own. They wanted him to disable defensive systems that protected Amy Torres, Chris Powell, Jake Williams, and all the others who had shown him kindness. The logical response was immediate compliance. He was a Velthari warrior on a military mission. Personal feelings were irrelevant compared to species loyalty and tactical objectives. His conditioning should have made the choice automatic. Instead, Zefkar found himself paralyzed by conflicting emotions he was not supposed to be capable of experiencing: guilt, loyalty, friendship, and something that might have been love for these strange, illogical beings who had somehow become his family. He walked the perimeter of Firebase Charlie that night, struggling with a decision that should have been simple. The base hummed with quiet activity as Marines maintained their vigilant watch. In the medical bay, wounded soldiers recovered under the care of human doctors who worked without rest. In the communication center, operators maintained contact with evacuation fleets carrying civilian refugees to safety. These humans were fighting for more than military victory. They were fighting for the right to exist, to raise children, to write poetry, to tell jokes, and to care for each other in ways that transcended tactical necessity. They were fighting for concepts his people considered weaknesses, but which somehow made them stronger than any enemy they had faced. When morning came, Zefkar made a choice that surprised him more than anyone else. He deleted the sabotage orders, without acting on them. For the first time in his life, he refused a direct command from Velthari High Command. The psychological barriers that had defined his existence for decades crumbled in that moment. He was no longer purely Velthari, but he was not yet human either. He had become something new, something broken, something that belonged fully to neither species. Colonel Miller found him sitting alone in the observation deck an hour later. The human commander sat down beside him without speaking, apparently sensing his emotional distress. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the universe," Miller said quietly. "Want to talk about it?" Zefkar almost confessed everything in that moment. The urge to tell Miller the truth was overwhelming. Instead, he asked a question that revealed more than he intended. What would you do if everything you believed about yourself turned out to be wrong? Miller considered the question. Seriously. The captured Velthari command ship changed everything. Human forces had managed to disable and board the vessel during a desperate battle near the asteroid belt, something Command had assured Zefkar was impossible. Now the ship sat in a secure facility on Luna Station, and Zefkar found himself face to face with the full scope of his people's plans. Captain Susan Brooks led the intelligence team examining the alien vessel. She was a career officer with 20 years of service, known for her analytical mind and steady demeanor under pressure. When she invited Jake Martinez to join the investigation team, Zefkar realized his cover identity had gained more trust than he ever intended. "We need every perspective we can get," Brooks explained as they entered the ship's data core. "You have been fighting these aliens longer than most. Your insights could help us understand what we are dealing with." The irony was crushing. Zefkar was being asked to help humans analyze technology he understood better than they ever would. Every system on the ship was familiar to him, every data structure as readable as his native language. But accessing that knowledge would mean revealing himself as the enemy he had been trained to remain. The data core contained detailed invasion plans spanning the next 5 years. Zefkar watched human faces grow pale as translators revealed the scope of Velthari intentions: complete extermination of human populations followed by systematic resource extraction. 12 billion people marked for elimination, their worlds designated for industrial conversion. Dr. Richard Clark, the team's xenobiologist, studied genetic modification protocols with growing horror. "They are not just planning to kill us," he said quietly. "They want to erase every trace that we ever existed. Our history, our culture, our DNA, everything." Dr. Nancy Price, a computer specialist, had accessed communication logs showing coordination between multiple Velthari fleets. "There are 17 battle groups involved in this operation. What we have been fighting is just the advance force. The main invasion begins in 6 months." Zefkar felt sick in ways his physiology was not designed to handle. Every human death he had witnessed, every act of courage and sacrifice, all of it was meaningless if his people succeeded in their larger plan. The Marines who had died protecting civilians, the medics who had worked without rest to save lives, the commanders who had held impossible positions. They were all just buying time for an extinction they could not prevent. The worst discovery came when Dr. Clark found biological profiles for every human prisoner the Velthari had captured. Detailed analysis of human psychology, physiology, and social structures, testing data from torture sessions designed to identify breaking points and exploitable weaknesses. "They have been studying us like laboratory animals," Clark said with controlled anger. "Every engagement, every battle, they were gathering intelligence on how we think and react." Captain Brooks examined the data with professional detachment, but Zefkar could see the effort it cost her. "This changes our entire strategic situation. If they understand us this well, conventional military doctrine is useless. We need to think of something they will not expect." The meeting was interrupted by alerts from Luna Station security. Unknown contacts were approaching from the outer system, moving too fast to be human vessels. The main Velthari invasion fleet had arrived 6 months early. Zefkar stood in the command center watching sensor displays show hundreds of alien ships deploying throughout the solar system. His people had decided to accelerate their timeline, probably because they had lost contact with their advance forces. The ships he was looking at carried enough firepower to sterilize every human world within days. "All stations, this is Admiral Davis," came the announcement over the communication system. "We are now at condition red. All military personnel report to battle stations. All civilian populations begin emergency evacuation procedures." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as human forces prepared for the largest battle in their history. Zefkar found himself assigned to a damage control team, helping to prepare Luna Station's defenses. The work kept his hands busy but could not quiet the war raging in his mind. His neural link crackled with Velthari battle communications. Fleet commanders coordinated their assault with the precision his species was famous for. They had identified key human military installations and were moving to eliminate them in order of strategic importance. Luna Station was third on their target list. Through his link, Zefkar could access real-time intelligence about Velthari fleet positions, weapon, capabilities and tactical plans. Information that could save thousands of human lives if he shared it. Information that would also reveal him as a traitor to his own species. The first wave of attacks began at 600 hours. Velthari ships struck human outposts throughout the outer system with devastating precision. Bases that had resisted for months fell within minutes to concentrated bombardment. The displays in Luna Station's command center showed red icons disappearing one by one as human positions were overrun. Captain Brooks stood at the center of the chaos, coordinating defensive efforts with calm authority. Redirect power from non-essential systems to shields and weapons. Signal all evacuation ships to increase speed. We may not be able to hold this position much longer. Dr. Clark approached her with data tablets showing analysis of Velthari ship formations. I think I see a pattern in their deployment. They are avoiding certain areas of space, possibly due to gravitational effects or sensor limitations. Can we use that? Brooks asked immediately. Maybe. If we could position our forces in those blind spots, we might achieve tactical surprise for a limited time. Zefkar listened to their conversation with growing internal conflict. He knew exactly why Velthari ships avoided certain positions. Their shields were vulnerable to specific types of radiation found near Jupiter's magnetic field. He could also identify 3 other weaknesses in their battle formation that human forces could exploit. The moral choice was clear, but it felt like choosing between 2 families. Helping humans meant betraying every Velthari warrior fighting in the fleet above, beings he had known since childhood. Not helping meant watching every human he had come to care about die in the next few hours. The decision was made for him when Velthari forces reached Luna Station. Energy beams sliced through the station's outer hull, venting atmosphere and killing dozens of people in seconds. The command center shook as defensive shields absorbed impacts that would have destroyed smaller vessels. Lieutenant Commander Paul Jackson took over tactical coordination when Captain Brooks was injured by flying debris. He was a young officer, barely 30 years old, but he adapted to the crisis with the flexibility Zefkar had learned to associate with human leadership. All fighters, form up on Attack Vector 7, Jackson ordered. We cannot match their firepower, but we can make them pay for every meter. Watching Jackson coordinate the defense with inadequate resources and inferior technology, Zefkar finally understood what had been wrong with his analysis from the beginning. He had been measuring human military effectiveness by Velthari standards, but humans were not trying to be superior warriors. They were trying to be something else entirely. They were trying to be worth saving. The realization broke the last of his psychological barriers. Standing in Luna Station's command center, surrounded by humans preparing to die for principles they held more valuable than life itself, Zefkar made his choice. Commander Jackson, he said quietly, approaching the tactical display. I have information about enemy fleet positions and vulnerabilities. Jackson looked up from his console with exhausted eyes. What kind of information? The kind that could save this station and everyone on it. For the next 2 hours, Zefkar fed real-time intelligence to human forces through his neural link. Fleet positions, weapon capabilities, shield frequencies, command protocols, everything his people had, kept secret for generations. He watched human tactics adapt instantly to exploit every weakness he revealed. The battle turned slowly but decisively. Human ships appeared in areas where Velthari sensors could not track them. Human weapons targeted precisely the shield generators and command centers that would cause maximum disruption. Human fighters coordinated attacks with an understanding of enemy capabilities that should have been impossible. When the Velthari fleet began withdrawing to regroup, Jackson turned to Zefkar with new understanding in his eyes. That was not standard military intelligence, was it? No, Zefkar said simply. It was not. Are you going to tell me who you really are? Zefkar looked around the command center at humans celebrating their impossible victory. Amy Torres was hugging her communications team. Chris Powell was writing frantically in his journal, trying to capture the moment in verse. Jake Williams was telling jokes that made people laugh despite their exhaustion. I am someone who chose sides, Zefkar said finally. Jackson nodded slowly. Good choice. But Zefkar knew the consequences were just beginning. His people would not forgive betrayal, and humans would never fully trust him once they learned the truth. He had become something that belonged to neither species, broken beyond any possibility of repair. The victory at Luna Station had saved thousands of lives, but it had cost Zefkar everything he had once been. The war ended not with a final battle but with a slow collapse that took 18 months to complete. Velthari forces, accustomed to quick victories through psychological warfare, found themselves unable to adapt to human unpredictability. Their rigid command structure, so effective against other species, became a liability when facing enemies who fought with hope instead of logic. Zefkar lived through it all as Jake Martinez, the human identity that had become more real to him than his birth name. He provided intelligence that turned the tide of dozens of battles, always careful to reveal only what was necessary to save lives. Each piece of information felt like another betrayal of his original nature, but he could no longer remember why that had once mattered. The final Velthari surrender came when their home fleet attempted to retreat to distant space. Human forces, now equipped with captured alien technology and understanding of their tactics, cut off the escape routes. Faced with complete annihilation, the surviving Velthari commanders chose capitulation over extinction. Zefkar watched the surrender ceremony from Luna Station's observation deck, standing beside humans who had no idea they were celebrating victory over his people. Commander Jackson had kept his secret, understanding somehow that the war's end would bring new complications for someone caught between species. Strange how quiet it is, said Amy Torres, now a sergeant after multiple field promotions. Her daughter had turned 7 during the war, growing up in evacuation centers while her mother fought across the galaxy. After all this time, I almost forgot what peace sounds like. Chris Powell nodded, still scribbling in the journal he had kept throughout the conflict. I have been trying to write about the end of the war, but I cannot find the right words. How do you describe the feeling of not having to be afraid anymore? Jake Williams, now a staff sergeant, smiled with the same humor that had carried him through the darkest moments. You write that we survived, we won, and we get to go home. Sometimes the simple truth is enough. Home. The word meant nothing to Zefkar anymore. The Velthari Empire had fallen, its remaining population scattered across refugee camps on distant worlds. He could not return to a civilization that no longer existed, and he could never truly belong among humans who would see him as their former enemy. The revelation of his true identity came 6 months after the armistice, when medical scans during Sierra routine post-war health examinations detected his alien physiology. Dr. Helen Foster, the psychiatrist assigned to help veterans cope with combat trauma, was the first to recognize what the data meant. You are not human, she said quietly during what was supposed to be a therapy session. The bone density, organ placement, neural patterns, everything is wrong for human anatomy. Zefkar had prepared for this moment for months, but actually facing exposure still felt like standing on the edge of an abyss. No, he said simply. I am not. Dr. Foster leaned back in her chair, studying him with professional interest, rather than fear or anger. Velthari? Yes. How long? From the beginning. I was sent to gather intelligence before the invasion. The silence stretched between them for several minutes. Finally, Dr. Foster spoke again. That explains some things about your psychological profile. You show signs of severe identity dissociation and cultural displacement trauma. Your conditioning is breaking down in ways that are causing serious mental health issues. Zefkar almost laughed at the clinical description of his spiritual destruction. Is there treatment for being broken beyond repair? Everyone can heal, Dr. Foster said firmly. The question is whether you want to try. The investigation that followed was handled quietly by military intelligence. Commander Jackson, now Admiral Jackson after his promotion, insisted that Zefkar's wartime actions be considered before any decisions were made about his fate. Amy Torres, Chris Powell, Jake Williams, and dozens of other Marines provided testimony, about the alien who had fought beside them for over 2 years. He saved my life at least 3 times that I can count, Amy told the review board. Probably more times that I do not know about. If he was a spy, he was the worst spy in history, because he kept protecting the people he was supposed to be gathering intelligence on. The board's final decision surprised everyone, including Zefkar. Rather than imprisonment or deportation, he was offered a choice: continue living as Jake Martinez with full veteran benefits and citizenship, or accept relocation to one of the Velthari refugee settlements. Why? Zefkar asked Admiral Jackson after the hearing. Because you chose to be one of us when it mattered most, Jackson replied. That makes you human in every way that counts. But choosing to be human and actually becoming human were different things. Zefkar discovered that his Velthari conditioning, designed to prevent emotional trauma, also prevented emotional healing. Humans processed grief and guilt through complex psychological mechanisms that his altered brain could not access. Dr. Foster worked with him for years, developing new therapeutic approaches for an entirely new type of patient. Your people bred out the capacity for recovery along with the capacity for pain, she explained during one session. You can feel emotions now, but you cannot heal from them the way humans do. The irony was perfect. In becoming capable of human feelings, Zefkar had lost the ability to cope with them as humans did. He felt guilt for every Velthari death his intelligence had caused, grief for the loss of his original identity, and love for humans who could never fully trust him. All of these emotions existed simultaneously in his mind, unable to fade or transform through normal psychological processes. His closest relationships were with other veterans who had shared the war's trauma. Tony Phillips, a Marine who had lost both legs in the fighting, became something like a brother to him. Tony understood the weight of carrying experiences that civilians could not comprehend. The thing about war, Tony said one evening as they watched sunset from his apartment balcony, is that it changes you in ways you cannot undo. The person you were before does not exist anymore. The question is whether you can learn to live with who you became. Amy Torres visited regularly, bringing pictures of her daughter and stories about civilian life. She had left the military to work in refugee resettlement, helping displaced populations rebuild their lives. Her acceptance of his true nature meant more to Zefkar than any official pardon. Chris Powell continued writing, eventually publishing a collection of war poetry that included verses about the alien who had fought alongside humans. He never used Zefkar's real name, but those who had been there understood the references. Jake Williams remained in the military, training new recruits with lessons learned from fighting aliens. His jokes about their former enemy were always gentle, never cruel, as if he understood that Zefkar was listening even when he was not present. The final act of healing came when Zefkar decided to write his own account of the war. Not for military historians or intelligence analysts, but for the human children who would grow up in the peace his betrayal had helped secure. He wrote about courage he had witnessed in desperate battles, about humans who chose hope over logic and love, over survival. He wrote about Marines who died protecting strangers and commanders who led through example rather than fear. Most importantly, he wrote about the discovery that strength could come from vulnerability, and that being broken was sometimes the first step toward becoming whole. The document was published anonymously, distributed through veteran support networks and refugee aid organizations. Those who read it recognize the voice of someone who had been there, who had seen both sides of the conflict and chosen humanity despite the cost. In his final entry, Zefkar wrote the words that would define the rest of his existence. They thought I could withstand humanity because I was built to be unbreakable, but I discovered that being unbreakable means being unable to grow, unable to change, unable to become something better. Humanity broke me, not through force, but through kindness. And in breaking me, they showed me what it truly means to be alive. I am broken beyond repair, and for the first time I am grateful for it. Years passed. Zefkar aged more slowly than his human friends, a reminder of his alien heritage that became easier to bear as time went on. He never fully healed from the psychological damage of his transformation, but he learned to live with the constant weight of divided loyalties and impossible choices. He attended Amy's daughter's graduation, watched Tony Phillips marry a nurse, who did not care about his missing legs, and helped Chris Powell organize poetry readings for veterans struggling with their own demons. He became part of the human community not despite his alien nature, but because of how he had chosen to use it. On quiet evenings, Zefkar would sit in the small apartment that had become his home and remember the warrior he had once been. That individual seemed like someone from another species now, someone who had measured worth through conquest and strength through dominance. The human he had become was weaker in every measurable way, more vulnerable to emotion and pain and loss. But this new self could experience joy and friendship and love, concepts that had been meaningless to his original nature. When Admiral Jackson visited on the anniversary of the war's end, he found Zefkar reading poetry in the garden behind his building.